This chart of the kings and the prophets is what we're looking at right now, and you have it in your syllabus material. And it's a well put together chart because it identifies all of the prophets that we're going to look at in this section. And you'll note that the northern kingdom of Israel is indicated by the blocks up on the top, and then the southern kingdom of Judah indicated by the blocks in the south. There's a split after Solomon. Northern kingdom of Israel. Israel sometimes is referred to as Joseph, sometimes referred to as Ephraim, sometimes referred to as Samaria. We'll just always try to refer to it as the northern kingdom of Israel. Judah is just Judah. We'll look at a map in just a moment. You'll see how Simeon is sort of buried in Judah. But we've looked at Jeroboam. Jeroboam is the son of Nebat. He is of no particular line that would be of a kingly line. But the kingly line will continue with the southern kingdom of Judah, and so Rehoboam will be seen within the lineage of Jesus, within Matthew's genealogy, because it will go David. Saul will not be included in that because Saul is of the tribe of Benjamin, but it will go David, and then his son Solomon, and then Solomon's son Rehoboam, and then Abijah or Abijam will be the next one, and then Asa and Jehoshaphat. The ones that are darkened in all of this are the kings that just have a terrible, evil nature, and you'll note in the northern kingdom they all follow after the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. That doesn't mean that Jeroboam the son of Nebat is the one who is primarily responsible, because they're all free moral agents and they make their own decisions. But there are 20 kings to the north, 20 kings to the south, and we're going to note a woman who is a usurper to the throne among the kings of the south. She'll be counted among that number of 20. But if you'll note, you'll see some smaller blocks under there. You see Ahijah and Edo and Jehu, and these are prophets. Elijah and Elisha are very well-known prophets in the northern kingdom of Israel. They do all their work in the northern kingdom. They don't come into the southern kingdom. And then when you come down to the southern kingdom, you'll see Shemaiah and Azariah and Hanani and Jehaziel. But then you get to Obadiah and Joel, and Obadiah and Joel are minor prophets. Chronologically, not the way it's organized within your Bible, but chronologically, Obadiah is the first of the minor prophets. And that's the time frame that we're going to find him right there. And you'll note on the chart just above Obadiah is an individual by the name of Athaliah. Athaliah is the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. You'll note Ahab on the northern kingdom. And she has been married off into the family of Jehoshaphat, of the southern kingdom there. And she married his son Jehoram. And you know that you'll note there on the chart, Jehoram's all darkened in because of Athaliah. Athaliah had such a great influence on him that he ended up being an evil king. And so we've got Athaliah in that particular spot. And then Ahaziah is right there in the middle of all of that. I think Jehoram, if I remember correctly, is the father. Ahaziah is the son. Ahaziah is married to Athaliah. And then as we move on, you'll see that we're going to be covering all the way up until the time of Hosea for the northern kingdom, and that will end in somewhere around the time of Hezekiah. And Hezekiah will be the last king of Judah that we will note in OT4, but we'll also be introduced to the earlier sections of Isaiah and Micah. And if you know anything about Isaiah, you remember Isaiah 7, verse 14, and the young woman shall conceive and bear a child, whose name shall be called Emmanuel. And that fits in with Matthew 1:23 when we're talking about the Christ. And that's a dual fulfillment prophecy. And that's going to appear right there in the reign of Ahaz there in the southern kingdom. Ahaz is not a good king. He's the father of Hezekiah, who is a good king. And then Hezekiah has a son who is the most apostate king in all of Judah, Manasseh, and he's a bad king. But during the reign of Ahaz, Ahaz has a problem, and in Isaiah 7 is where we pick up Ahaz. So that's where we pick up Isaiah. And Micah is contemporary. Micah is a minor prophet, but Micah is contemporary with Isaiah. So he'll be prophesying right around the same time. And you say, well, how come you got two prophets down there prophesying at the same time? Well, you may actually have more than two prophets. They're just not recorded in the text. God may have raised up all sorts of prophets who are going throughout the land and bringing basically some of the same message to people in different geographic locations, since, you know, he can't just hop on a bus or hop on a train or get into his car and be over in the next county in just a few moments, or in the next tribe in this particular case in a few moments. And so there may be all sorts of prophets, and they're just not recorded, and there's no need to have them recorded. But Isaiah and Micah are, and they will be the two prophets that we will note as we're dealing with the southern kingdom. You'll note that Jonah and Amos are also found with the northern kingdom. Jonah will not prophesy. He is a prophet of the northern kingdom in the time of Jeroboam II, but he will not prophesy anything that's recorded in Scripture except for his trip, his very quick trip, his very smelly trip to Nineveh to preach to the Gentiles. Amos then is an interesting prophet because Amos comes from the southern kingdom traveling to the northern kingdom, and then Hosea fits into this time period also. And Hosea is really God with a broken heart. Is dealing with the marriage relationship between the people of God and how they have just gone off in the wrong direction. So that's as far as we're going to go when we finish up with OT4. Just to give you an idea of what chariot warfare was like in those days, this is a Sumerian chariot. The Sumerians, of course, lived down in the area of the coming together with the Tigris and Euphrates, down in that area that is called the original garden, the original paradise area. Of course, really changed after the flood. The whole geography of that area was, there were 4 rivers at one time, and now there's just 2 rivers down there, and still 2 rivers down there, the Tigris and Euphrates. And this is a Sumerian chariot, and this is somewhere around 2500 BC. And you can see that it probably was not too speedy. Not with the very basic wheels that you have right there. And of course it's being pulled by mules. Not quite like the Borax 20 mule team, but probably not much faster. And you've got a spearman rather than an archer at this particular time. Now, chariots would really evolve. This is Ramses II, and this is about 1200 BC, and now the chariot has evolved into a very lightweight chariot. We know the exact dimensions of this chariot and the weight of this chariot because we have found, archaeologists have found within some of the pharaoh's tombs, one of these chariots completely ready for assembly for the afterlife for the pharaoh who was buried there. And of course, they always many times buried him with slaves and horses. Of course, the horses and the slaves wouldn't survive the ordeal. But this was, and food and all sorts of things to take care of him in the afterlife. And this is a very fast, very lightweight chariot. They were originally just used for scouting purposes, but in this particular case, this is used for warfare. And this is also the further development of the horse by this time. The horse was originally found in the steppes of the Caucasus, which is way to the north, and were then brought into the Palestine, the Promised Land, by individuals like the Hittites. The Hittites introduced the horse and the chariot, and then eventually made its way down to Egypt, and Egypt then turned it into some type of fighting vehicle with an archer. And the original horse was called Equus, and not any bigger than a St. Bernard. But through inbreeding in that area of the steppes of the Caucasus, which is all plains, grassland area, the horse was then developed through inbreeding within the horse and became a larger horse, at least enough to pull a chariot or for a man to ride on. Early horses were still rather small, and the rider would ride back on the haunches of the horse rather than the middle of its back, very much like a donkey can be ridden today. But the horse was then developed as time went on and became larger and larger. And of course, we get up into the Dark Ages and the medieval time period, and now you're dealing with some big horses that have to carry knights who are dressed in full armor, and many times the horse was armored. And so we want bigger and bigger and bigger horses. Bigger is better. And of course, we end up with horses like Belgian draft horses and Clydesdales and horses that are large like that. Horses, sadly, were used right up in World War I. In fact, World War II, a Polish squadron charged German machine guns during World War II, and that was probably the last cavalry charge we'll ever see on the face of this earth. Such a terrible disaster. And these are the Hittites. Hittites come a little bit better prepared. They are very interesting people, come out of what is now known as Central Turkey, and it's only been in more recent years that we've found out a lot of information about the Hittites. Prior to that time, people who saw the name in the Bible said, oh, that's just a make-believe people, they're really not around. And then archaeologists discovered the capital city and all sorts of other information concerning the Hittites. But, they were a fierce warrior race type of people, and they are constantly noted within the text of the Old Testament. And these are the Hittites. And we know these drawings are accurate. These are not the vivid imagination of the artist. There is no artistic license with these drawings. These drawings are accurate because they're taken from funerary items. Either the chariot or pieces of chariot were buried with the warrior, or there were carvings that were done, and the carvings would always depict properly, exactly. It would be a very disgraceful thing in a funerary item to be depicting what the warrior looked like, other than the reality of what the warrior really looked like. So the armor that's on the horses, the bridles, and all of the things that go along with this chariot would be extremely accurate. When we get up into the time of the Roman Empire, we again rely upon a few artifacts that are found from the Roman Empire as far as weaponry is concerned, but of course we're dealing with Iron Age and steel weapons, and so steel weapons deteriorate rather rapidly with time, the rusting process. And so we again depend upon funerary items. Or if a legion was crossing a river and several of the legionaries drowned and their armor was sank to the bottom and then was covered by mud, we sometimes find things like, archaeologists find things like that, and they can determine all of that. So the armor that you see in my office and all of the shield and everything, that's absolutely accurate because of funerary items or pieces that have been found. So the Hittites, and we're going to see the Hittites as we go through this Old Testament section. So we've looked at Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and we've seen the man of God out of Judah, and what happened to the man of God when he did not follow the very command of God, and he went in the wrong direction, and the old prophet buried the man of God. We see that down there at the bottom of that page of the syllabus. That map is not very good for you to see, but this gives you a little bit of an idea as to what this all looked like at that particular time, some of the major areas that we're going to be looking at. This is a stone that deals with a fellow that we're going to note in just a moment, Pharaoh by the name of Shishak. And this stone was unearthed in more recent times, and it is a depiction of Shishak. His name, you can't see it right there, but his name is in the lower right-hand corner. That's probably the cartouche is sometimes what it's called, the cartouche of Shishak. So that's an indicator that there really was a real Shishak, even though the Bible told us a long time ago there was. Well, now archaeologists say, oh, yeah, there really was a Shishak. All these years we said he didn't exist, and here it is. So that's the stone. Now this 12 tribes of Israel right here, this particular depiction gives you a good idea. Do you see Simeon down there in Judah? Simeon's really sort of buried in Judah. And then if you just go a little bit to the north of Judah, right there on the border, you've got Benjamin. And so Benjamin and Judah, taking along with them Simeon, form the southern kingdom. And then all of the rest of that, Reuben and Gad and Dan and Ephraim and the two half-tribes of Manasseh, one on the west side and the other on the east side of the Jordan, Issachar, Zebulun, Naphtali, and Asher, and all of that is found in the northern kingdom. Now you note on that map also the Arameans. Arameans are the Syrians. They're sometimes referred to as the Arameans, primarily because the language that they speak is Aramaic language. So that's their first language of choice. And Aramaic language is the first language of choice among the Syrians, the Assyrians, two different people, and the Babylonians. So when the Jews come back from Babylonian captivity, after 70 years of captivity, they are bringing with them the Aramaic language, and so we find the Hebrew language is virtually tumbled into the obscurity of a language of liturgy, very much like the Latin language became a language of liturgy with the Roman Catholics. And so the Aramaic the Hebrew becomes that. It's still used by the priests. And of course, Hebrew today, the language of modern Israel, has a Germanic background. It's called Yiddish. And so it's not even, but the priests, or not the priests, but the rabbis are still involved in the Hebrew language, even in modern day Israel today. But Aramaic becomes the language, and that's the language that Jesus is speaking when he cries out on the cross, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? It's the Aramaic language. But also these people are well versed, especially those of the merchant trade, in the Greek in the New Testament. So there's a Koine Greek, and the Aramaic language is being spoken and recognized by the people of the time. But here in this time, we're just dealing with the Hebrew, we're dealing with the Aramaic language, with the Arameans, and then you'll note the Philistines right there. The ones that you don't see, which would be further up the coastline, would be the Phoenicians, But you see the Philistines, the people of Amalek, the people of Edom, the people of Moab, the people of Ammon, and then, of course, the Aramean. So they're still surrounded by people that are not very friendly. And we're going to see a great deal of conflict as we go through this OT4. This is just, I don't know if I have this in your syllabus or not. This is a Phoenician temple. This is what a Phoenician temple would have looked like. It's a rather basic structure, but as you're thinking of Samson, you might consider that people are up on the roof and he's down in the temple itself, and he sets his shoulder against two of those pillars, and that, of course, ruins the structural integrity of the roof, and the roof comes tumbling down, and the Philistines are killed. Well, this is a Phoenician temple right here, but the Phoenicians and the Philistines, their temples would be very much alike. There would be that much difference. But that would give you an idea. And when we come to the work of Hiram, who is a Phoenician who is working with David and supplying materials eventually for the temple that Solomon will be built, we're probably looking at more of a Phoenician architectural design than we are of a strictly Hebrew design. There's not much in the way of architectural originality with the Jews. When the Jews come into the land, what do they move into? Houses that are already there. So why spoil a good thing? You know, if it's not broken, don't fix it. So if that house worked for the people who were the inhabitants of the land and everything you need, then you just leave it that way. And that architectural design then just continues on for generation after generation after generation. But so does basic farming, basic use of a plow, basic use of whatever items are used in farming, just go from generation to generation to generation to generation. And so when we come up to that time before the Industrial Revolution, not much has changed. It's being done pretty much the same way that Daddy did it, and Granddaddy did it, and Great-Granddaddy did it. And property remains within the family, and that's the way the farm goes, passed on from generation to generation. And so it's only with the ability to make stronger metal and the steam engine, then we start having big changes. This is the hill of Samaria, and this is what archaeologists believe that the palace, once the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel decide on a city, and that won't happen until Ahab's time period, his father, and this would be Omri. Omri is his father, and it's during the time of Omri that this is built. Then this becomes the capital, the capital city of the northern empire, and this would be what that palace would have looked like. And in the photograph at the bottom, that's all that remains of it today. It's just, again, an archaeological dig. This is Megiddo. We're going to be talking about Megiddo. Megiddo is a fortress area in the valley of Esdraelon. If you look at a map, you'll see that Mount Carmel is a slight projection that projects out into the Mediterranean, from the Mediterranean shoreline there in the Promised Land. And then there's a valley that is situated from a northwesterly position down to a southeasterly position, angled down. That's called the Valley of Esdraelon. And at the foot of the Valley of Esdraelon is the city of Megiddo, and there's a fortress at Megiddo, and there's also a great plains area at Megiddo. And so when we come to the Revelation and we're looking at a final battle taking place, it's at the mountain of Megiddo, or Har Megiddon, or Armageddon. And so that's the part that Megiddo plays in all that. This is just collecting taxes, and of course they're putting the taxes down into a pit, which would be very easy as far as the security of that in taking care of it. So the photograph of that bank vault is on the right, and the drawing of it is there on the left. So we come to our syllabus, and we're going to go to 1 Kings 13 and verses 33 and 34. If you look there over the northern kingdom, or underneath the section, the northern kingdom of Israel, you're going to see that Jeroboam continues in his evil way, and he doesn't make any changes, even though he's undergone a withered hand. That doesn't seem to have much effect on him. And sometimes we forget very quickly those things that take place that are even traumatic. We still go back, sometimes human beings go back and do the same stupid things all over again that brought him such difficulty to begin with. But in 1 Kings 13, verses 33 and 34, it says, after this event, that's where his dried hand and recovery took place. Jeroboam did not return from his evil way, but given the priests of the high places, from among all the people, any who would. It's like, got any volunteers today? Would you like to be a priest? A little bit of pay, a little bit of food goes along with it. To be priests of the high places, and this event became sin to the house of Jeroboam, even to blot it out and destroy it from off the face of the earth. Now at this time, in 1 Kings 14, we're introduced to Ahijah. He's one of the named prophets, but he's not a literary prophet. In other words, he doesn't write anything. What material is found with Ahijah is written about him. So the inspired writer that's writing this book of Kings, and remember in its original form, in the Hebrew Bible, it is just simply Kings. It's not 1 Kings, 2 Kings, it's just simply Kings. And when you get to Chronicles, it's just simply Chronicles, not 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles. So here in this writing is referred to as the writing of the Kings. The inspired writer tells us, God tells us, through the inspired writer, about Ahijah the prophet. And we find in verses 1 through 4 of this section that Ahijah, the son of Jeroboam, becomes ill. At that time, Abijah, the son of Jeroboam, became sick. And Jeroboam said to his wife, arise now and disguise yourself, so that they may not know that you're the wife of Jeroboam. Well, why does Jeroboam not want his wife to be recognized? What do you think? Why? Just give it some thought.
Probably because he knows what he's been doing has been wrong.
Yeah, so if the people are suffering at his hand, and they may be by this time, if people are suffering at his hand, what a coup to get a hold of his wife and maybe hold her for ransom or do something and get him to change his mind.
Was Shiloh in the northern kingdom?
Yes.
Okay.
Anyone else have any thoughts as to why he says, disguise yourself?
Try and fool the prophet?
Yeah, try to fool the prophet. Of course, not going to work, but just to try to fool the prophet. Because he has such a bad reputation, the prophet may not want to give him any information through his wife if he knows this is the wife of Jeroboam. So there may be some other reasons, but that's what he tells her to do. It says, so they may not know that you are the wife of Jeroboam, go to Shiloh. Shiloh is 10 miles north of Bethel. Remember, Bethel is right on the border of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. It's 10 miles north of Bethel, and it's 18 miles south of Tirzah. Now, Tirzah is an early capital of the northern kingdom before Samaria becomes capital.
10 miles north of Bethel, you said?
10 miles north of Bethel, about 18 miles south of Tirzah. So go to Shiloh. Behold, Ahijah the prophet is there, who spoke concerning me, that I would be king over this people. Now, Shiloh is well known from an earlier time, because Shiloh is where the tabernacle finds its resting place before it is finally gathered up and makes its way eventually, after all sorts of difficulties in the path, eventually makes its way into a tent in David's Jerusalem, and then eventually will be found in the temple. But Shiloh becomes a place of the tabernacle back in the time of Samuel. We're looking at the Judges. Go to Shiloh, behold, Ahijah the prophet is there. So Jeroboam knows there's a prophet, and he's a prophet of God. You notice how he doesn't go to any of his priests or prophets? He knows they can't do anything for him. Isn't it interesting, a guy who's this wicked, when he needs help, who does he go to? Goes to God. Goes to God. Now, isn't that just so typical? When people, many times in the world, find themselves in difficulty, and they've exhausted all their resources, that finally they say, well, I guess it's come to this. Guess I better go to God. So, Ahijah the prophet is there, who spoke concerning me, that I would be king over this people. Now remember, Ahijah is the one earlier on that we looked at, who tore his robe into 12 pieces. He gave 10 of those pieces to Jeroboam. So since that prophecy came true, he's pretty sure this is a prophet of God. Verse 3, and take 10 loaves with you, some cakes. Now, cakes right there are not cakes like we think of cakes. These are generally what is seen as dried fruit. Raisin cakes would be very popular. Date cakes would be very popular. And what they do is they take the dates and the raisins and they put them in a press, and they compress them and get them to the point where there's not much of any moisture in them, and they're compacted enough that once they dry, they're like a brick. And so you would carry that with you if you were out on a journey, and maybe you'd have a raisin cake with you, this brick of raisins. And when you stopped at night, you'd have some water with you. You might build a fire, and you had a pot with you, and you just took some of this raisin cake and cut a section off, and maybe threw it into the pot with everything else. And so it would be something that's a fast food, a dehydrated food that you could carry with you. And so they were very popular. And so she's going to take not only bread, but cake. Now remember, the bread of this day is a circular loaf, like a big fat frisbee. And that's the way the bread was baked. All the way up into Roman times, bread was designed that way. And bread will not, of course, last any time at all. We have all sorts of junky preservatives in our bread that we're probably going to wipe us out one day. But it's there so that the bread will last a little bit longer. Notice they give consideration to the bread lasting longer, but not so much consideration to the one who's eating the bread. So, but that's what she's going to take. 10 loaves, and that would be a bread, and that would either be wheat or barley. Those are the two grains of choice. Barley is generally the grain of the poorer people. With you, some cakes and a jar of honey. And so that would make a pretty good meal, you know. You take a piece of bread and break it off, and take some of this raisin and moisten it, put it on there, and smear it with honey, and boy, it's almost as good as peanut butter and jelly. He will tell you what will happen to the boy. So he's very confident that he knows exactly what this Ahijah will do, or Ahijah. And it's Ahijah concerning the little boy whose name is Abijah. And Jeroboam's wife did so, and arose and went to Shiloh and came to the house of Ahijah. Now Ahijah could not see, for his eyes were dim because of his age. That's the same word right there. The word for dim in the Hebrew is the same word that's used in 1 Samuel 4 and verse 15. And that is the word that is used for Eli's eyes at that particular time. And medically, since these people worked outside a lot, and they didn't have anything cosmetically to take care of dry skin, more than likely, it's time, other than just putting olive oil on your face, more than likely as time would go on, they develop some pretty serious wrinkles at an early age. But after having been sunburned on a number of occasions and their eyes not being shaded, this is in an era before sunglasses, and an era when actually hats are not worn, being out there bareheaded in the field. The problem with your eyes and getting too much sunlight is cataracts. And so when we're looking at these eyes, the eyes of these individuals just slowly dimming, we're probably looking at a cataract problem. Of course, cataracts can be taken care of quite simply through laser surgery today, but there is, in this day and age, there's no known solution for cataracts. Perhaps if they kept their eyes shaded and kept some sort of covering on, that might not have happened to many of them. That's probably what we're looking at. No way to know for sure, but his eyes are growing dim. This is Ahijah. And it's mentioned here because, remember, she has disguised herself. She's come in secret. So this would compound the problem of his recognizing her if he couldn't even see her. So when you look at verses 5 through 18, you see Ahijah's prophecy concerning the house of Jeroboam. It says, now the Lord has said to Ahijah, well, that just spills the beans right there. She's not going to be able to sneak up on him. The Lord had said to Ahijah, so previous to her appearing on the scene, behold, the wife of Jeroboam is coming to you to inquire of you concerning her son, for he is sick. You shall say thus and thus to her, for it will be when she arrives, she will pretend to be another woman. You're not going to pull anything over on Ahijah here. And it came about when Ahijah heard the sound of her feet coming in the doorway. Now, of course, as your vision goes, many times your hearing sort of intensifies, unless you're real old and both your vision and your hearing go at the same time. But generally, young people who are a little bit younger, once the vision goes, the hearing overcompensates for the lack of vision. And deaf people, people who are blind especially, have many times good hearing and can make a distinction between this individual and that individual as they walk into a room. So he heard the sound of her feet coming in the doorway, that he said, come in, wife of Jeroboam. Why do you pretend to be another woman? For I am sent to you with a harsh message. Well, that doesn't bode well for Jeroboam's wife. And really, you're going to feel a little bit sorry for Jeroboam's wife because of the message she's going to receive. Just keep that in mind as the message is revealed to her. Go say to Jeroboam, verse 7, thus says the Lord God of Israel, because I exalted you from among the people and made you leader over my people Israel, and tore the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you. And he did that in a show and tell, remember, by the tearing of the robe. Yet you have not been like my servant David. Isn't that interesting? He doesn't say like my servant Solomon. He says like my servant David. So David's reputation continues on even after his death. Who kept my commandments and who followed me with all his heart to do only that which was right in my sight. You also have done more evil than all who were before you, and have gone and made for yourself other gods and molten images, and provoke me to anger, and have cast me behind your back. Now, the phrase that is used right there is a very interesting phrase, cast me behind your back. It's used only here and in Ezekiel 23 and verse 35. And really, it denotes in what it envisions, it denotes the most scornful contempt that one could have for God. Because it's as though you were following God at one time, and then as sin entered into your life, you picked God up and threw him over your shoulder so that he would be behind you. Now, if he's behind you, then you're no longer following him. You're going your own separate, sinful way. So it's a very descriptive term right here. Have cast me behind your back. And really, as we loosen our grip on God, we're supposed to cling to him and hold on to it because he's going in the right direction. When we loosen our grip, then we will eventually just throw him behind us. He's worthless in our eyes because we don't want to be bothered, because self is absolutely taking over our lives. You know, the biggest problem that you and I have is self. Self. And if we can ever get a good handle on the self problem, we'll get a good handle on the sin problem. Because self interferes so many times in our life. You know, I want that, so we'll sin to get it. Or I don't want to do that. And that's self-speaking, because self just doesn't want to do that. And if we could ever get a handle on that. Of course, we live in an extremely selfish society at this time in life. And because of the great selfishness of those around us, we tend to become tainted by selfishness, and self enters into our life. I mean, if you can do it, why can't I do it? That guy just moved by me at 85 miles an hour. Why can't I do that? You can. Both of you may be pulled over, but you can. But self gets in the way. That's the problem that we have. The problem is selfishness. And when you're looking at Jesus, you'll never see any self problem. He is in the absolute in selflessness. And God is the absolute in selflessness. When you're looking at Philippians 2, beginning of verse 5, and we're talking about him leaving the very form of God and coming down to this earth to be found as a doulos, a bond slave. That's God. That's God serving. That's God serving. And he provides us by his grace, and as one who serves, he provides us with the air that we breathe, and the water that we drink, and the beautiful place that we live in, all of that. And he provides us with service. And yet, we want to deny all that and throw him behind our back. So that's a very interesting thought that's expressed right there about throwing. You have cast me behind your back. Therefore, verse 10, therefore, behold, I am bringing calamity on the house of Jeroboam. Will cut off from Jeroboam every male person, both bond and free in Israel. And I will make a clean sweep of the house of Jeroboam, as one sweeps away dung until it is all gone. I imagine some of you have cleaned out a horse stable before, and you probably don't like to leave any of that around. The idea is to get rid of all of that, so you sweep away all the dung. And that's what God says. You're nothing more than dung, and I'm going to get rid of all of that. Now, Jeroboam's evil will bring about an end to his house, and it'll end with the death of his son Nadab. And that's over in 1 Kings 15, verses 25 through 30. So Jeroboam's house will last just one generation past his death. 1 Kings 15, verses 25 through 30. That'll be the end of it.
1 Kings 15, Mark.
25 through 30. In verse 11, he says, anyone belonging to Jeroboam who dies in the city, the dogs will eat. Now, that's a disgraceful, well, that's really a lack of a proper burial, so it's a disgraceful thing. That no one cares about your dead body, they're just going to leave it there. And the birds and the dogs are always referred to as garbage disposals in this sense. Dogs did not really serve as household pets. Most of them were feral, and they would have just been mobile garbage disposals. We'll see that a little bit later on when we see the death of Jezebel. And they were around just eat the garbage, just like flies are around eat garbage. That's what they did. Although when you get up into more Roman times, you'll find dogs were being kept as security dogs. If you ever go to Pompeii, you'll enter the courtyard of one of the houses that's been restored. In Pompeii, none of the second story remains. It's just all first story that was covered with ash. And because the second story was above the ash, and so after the destruction of Pompeii, people went back and used that top section that was still in place, which you didn't have to dig very deep to get at, as construction material for their houses. So those top stories of the houses in Pompeii are found all over that area as separate houses. If you ever go to Great Britain and go up to Hadrian's Wall, that was a wall constructed by the Emperor Hadrian to keep out those nasty Picts and those Celts to the north, and really was quite successful as long as it was manned. But that wall is not as tall as it once was because all the barns in the area are constructed of the top section of Hadrian's Wall. And people just use building material why would you go out and cut new stone when you can just go dismantle part of that wall or dismantle the top floors of houses of Pompeii? So that's what's been done. But in Pompeii, there is a house that when you walk into the courtyard, there's a mosaic on the ground that you would walk across. The mosaic is made up of different colored stones and depicts an image. Well, the image is a dog with a chain on it. And in Latin, it says, beware of the dog. So there's no new signs, beware of the dog today. That's an interesting sign. Beware of the dog.
David, has God taken care of Jeroboam and others like the man of God who disobeyed? Was there any indication that I didn't see? Was there any indication in another place to where he took care of the prophet who came and lied to the man of God who caused him to?
Yeah, it does say he just tells his sons to bury him in the place where he's going.
Right, when he dies.
But that would have been a terrible thing for him, having done that, having realized what he did, and not wanting to be out of sorts with God, but having done that, and then to live the rest of his life with that on his mind. Of course, he'd be forgiven of that. There's no problem with that. But that's just a terrible thing. You never forget that. And really, the responsibility is really not upon that prophet. The responsibility is upon the man of God who should have followed exactly what God told him to do, and he didn't do that. So that's where the emphasis is. When God tells you to do something, you need to do it exactly the way He tells you. You just don't let anybody else get in the way of doing that which is right. So here we have the removal of Jeroboam's house, and the fact that verse 11, all of the burials, the people just sort of stay away. Oh, that's one of Jeroboam's cousins. Just leave them, dogs will take care of them. Anyone belonging to Jeroboam who dies in the city, the dogs will eat. He who dies in the field, the birds of the heavens will eat, for the Lord has spoken it. In very Hebrew terminology, many times God's battles, God always wins his battles, and then the bodies of those warriors that are defeated are left to the beasts and the birds of the sky. We'll see that terminology later on. It's very, very Hebrew thought. And that was exactly the way it happened. People in ancient times understood that if you leave too many dead bodies around, there's going to be disease that follows. So it was not unusual either to bury the body as quickly as possible, or if one was not able to bury the body, then to gather all the bodies in a big amount of wood and cremate the bodies so that there wouldn't be any disease that would follow on. But if it was a battlefield that was off someplace and there was nobody living around it, those bodies would just decompose right there and be eaten by the animals, and bones be dragged here and there, just like things are done today. Those same things happen. Or somebody's lost and they find somebody is doing some hiking, they find a skull, and then some distance away they find a leg bone. That's animals have gotten in there, just pull them apart and take them off. So very disgraceful thing here, though, among the Jews. You want to be buried in the tomb of your fathers. So that's not going to happen. Not going to happen. So he's telling this is a word of God through the prophet Ahijah. He's telling her all of this. She has come just to find out, is my son going to recover or not? That was really the main reason for her. But all of this detail is expressed beforehand, and it's expressed beforehand because the result of the sin in Jeroboam's family line is going to bring about the non-recovery of the child. But listen to this, what he says about the child. Verse 12, now you arise, go to your house. When your feet enter the city, the child will die. Now think about Mama for a moment. She'll never again see her child alive. Because the prophecy says as soon as her feet enter the city, he's going to die. That would almost make you want to never go back home. But she's going to go back home. Because the plight of a woman in those days was such that you had to be supported by your husband. Verse 13, and all Israel shall mourn for him. So he's a good child. We don't know his age. For he alone of Jeroboam's family shall come to the grave. In other words, a respected burial. But more than that, come to the grave carries with it the idea that everybody else will be eaten by dogs or eaten by birds. This is not going to happen to this son because this son has found favor in God's sight. So out of the whole family of Jeroboam, you got one. But he would come to the grave because in him something good was found toward the Lord God of Israel in the house of Jeroboam. So even though the child is going to die, the child is in the right relationship with God. The child's going to be okay. The son. It doesn't say child, it says son. So maybe a teenage son, maybe just a young son. Just no way to know that this son's going to be taken care of. Now, there are times when God, I believe, says, in the case of people, many times, faithful people, and many times when they're ill, God says, you've suffered enough. And he takes them. We have, who do we have in the Genesis account? Remember? Enoch. Enoch is taken. And it's almost like God says, I just can't stand what you're having to go through, and you're just going to come home and be with me. And those are good thoughts, especially when you're dealing with the funeral of a small child. You don't want to dwell on that a lot, but certainly the child is in a much better place. The grief of the parents many times will determine exactly what you're going to say in this way. So you need to be careful. But that's always my thought with the death of the righteous. That God says, that's enough. That's enough. No more. You're going to come home and be with me. And that seems to be the case with this son. And then going down to verse 14, moreover, the Lord shall raise up for himself a king over Israel, who shall cut off the house of Jeroboam this day and from now on. Now, that king is going to be the third king. His name is Baasha. You'll see him in the listing, Baasha. And he's found in 1 Kings 15, verses 27 through 29. 1 Kings 15, verses 27. His name is Baasha. B-A-A-S-H-A, Baasha. But he's the one that takes the house of Jeroboam out of the way. And so very typically, when you're removing a royal house among the ancients, you remove everybody. Because there's always the problem of vengeance somewhere down the line. So if you just take care of all of the family, take care of the mother and the father and all the children and the uncles and all, and everybody who's connected with the family, then you don't have to worry about any of that. Even though they were innocent in the matter, you just wipe them off. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that's exactly what is done.
Is that why Achan's family was punished with
Yep. Plus the fact that they were probably complicit in the affair. Because how would you be able to live in the tent, that close proximity, and not know what had been done? And plus the fact he may have even bragged about it to his family, that he's taking care of them, got your college fund right here. And none of the family would have obviously said anything. They would have been taking this up.
It says he's the son of Ahijah, but it's a different Ahijah, correct? It's not the prophet.
Oh, you're talking about,
The Baasha?
yeah, this is a different one.
Yeah.
Some of these names are very popular names at the time. Anything with an AH ending is like anything with an EL ending. It means something of God. So those names generally were very popular names. This one is Baasha. So, but there doesn't seem to be a connection. Ahijah is a connection. AH. So this day and from now on, and then in verse 15, for the Lord will strike Israel as a reed is shaken in the water. Reeds are not very strong. And he will uproot Israel from this good land which he gave to their fathers, and will scatter them beyond the Euphrates River, because they made their Asherim, provoking the Lord to anger. Now what he's talking about here in verse 15 is way off in the future. He's talking about the Assyrians taking off the northern kingdom of Israel into Assyrian captivity. And that's still some 200 years in the future. But he's going to tell them right now. And that would give them the opportunity to perhaps forestall that by getting right with God. But the message doesn't take. So they have been involved with idolatry. Now, it doesn't say Euphrates in the original text, it just says river. But anytime river is noted within that context, it's always the Euphrates.
I'm curious, since Assyria isn't mentioned here,
Yep.
how would the people of Israel know that? I mean, clearly this is a prophet speaking, so this is a future event, but I mean, would they be able to ask the prophet and say, who exactly are you talking about here? Or is this just a general warning that if you don't correct your ways,
It's just
you will...
it's just a general warning that there is an enemy out there who will be powerful enough at the time to take you captive into their land.
Okay.
And they do cross the Euphrates to get back into Assyria.
So this is more along the lines of God just saying, look, if you don't straighten up, you're not going to last long.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just like, could God tell us right now how the United States of America is going to end? Yes. If we have enough general information that we better get ourselves straightened out. We need to get in detail.
What is Asherim?
Asherim be one of the idolatrous gods, the god of the Asherah. Generally a carved image. Ashtaroth is another part of the Asherim. Anytime you find, and that's another Hebrew word's been made into an English word, the I am ending is always in the plural form. So what he's referring to right here when he says Asherim, he's talking about more than one. They have made the Asherim all that belong to Ashtaroth. And you've provoked the Lord to anger. His anger is a very controlled anger, and it's a very just anger. It's never a blind anger. It's never like man's anger. It's not an anger that uncontrollably lashes out at any who are around. But nevertheless, it is anger. So he's going to give up Israel on account of the sins of Jeroboam, which he committed, with which he made Israel sin. And you can see that in verse 16. Verse 17, then Jeroboam's wife arose. I imagine she is absolutely conflicted at this point. You almost feel sorry for her. And departed and came to Tirzah. Tirzah is where the capital is at that time. This is where Jeroboam would be. And as she was entering the threshold of the house, so as she touches the threshold of the house, which would be the doorstep, that raised portion of the door, there's always a raised block there. In other words, you always had to step up, because if there's any water and it comes running down the street, there's no drainage sewer system. You don't want the water running in underneath the door into the house, so you place the step up. As she was entering the threshold of the house, the child died, and all Israel buried him and mourned for him. That was exactly what was noted by Ahijah, according to the word of the Lord which he spoke through his servant Ahijah the prophet. So, sort of a sadness to all of that. But as we're looking at this chronologically, you'll note in your syllabus, we leave the northern kingdom of Israel. There's going to be some other things that are going to happen, but they're going to happen later on. So we have a great period of silence here concerning the day-to-day activity. And of course, the reason why God highlights instead of elaborates is that if he elaborates in written form, we don't have a Bible that we can carry around with us. As far as words and writing, it is an economy of words. In fact, when you're looking at the difference between English vocabulary and Hebrew vocabulary, there are just hundreds more in the area of English words than there are Hebrew words. You find a number of Hebrew words that will have more than one meaning, and context will determine how the word is being used. But it's a great language. Military fortifications, you go back to Judah, in 2 Chronicles 11, verses 5 through 12. Military fortifications being constructed by Rehoboam. Rehoboam's the one who originally wanted to send an army in there and take the land back. So now He's decided to fortify. You can go over there. We're not going to read all of that, but 2 Chronicles 11 will be in verses 5 through 12. You can see all the cities that he built right there. And then in 2 Chronicles 11, verses 18 through 23, you see Rehoboam's family. So then Rehoboam took as a wife Mahalath, the daughter of Jeremiah, the son of David, and of Abihail, the daughter of Eliab, the son of Jesse. So, staying within the family, hopefully not too close, staying within the family. And remember that at different times we have found marriages that take place between brothers and sisters. In Abraham's case, Abraham and Sarah had the same father but different mothers. So you're looking at half sister, half brother. And early on, it doesn't bring about the problems, medical problems, that it will in more later times. Hemophilia being, of course, called bleeder's disease, which is a real bad disease connected with too close of an intermarriage. And found generally among the kings of England who spent too much time marrying within the family line. But early on, among the pharaohs of Egypt, it was always brother and sister. So always brother and sister. They thought that kept the lineage of these gods and goddesses, as the pharaohs were considered to be, kept them pure. And it really did. It eventually would mess things up. Cleopatra V, who was the last Cleopatra of the Ptolemies, is the Cleopatra of Antony and Cleopatra. And she's supposed to marry her younger brother. She cannot even stand the sight of it. And so she has a child by Julius Caesar and then twins by Mark Antony. You know, you're going to mess around with her brother. In fact, if she can find the proper time, she's going to kill him. A little bit of sibling rivalry there could take into the excess. So brothers and sisters married would not be absolutely unusual among ancients, especially within royalty. So here you have a family line that's a little bit close with Rehoboam. And verse 19 goes on to note the children that are born to Rehoboam and Mahalath. And verse 21, it says, Rehoboam loved Maacah, the daughter of Absalom, more than all his other wives and concubines, for he had taken 18 wives and 60 concubines, fathered 28 sons and 60 daughters. And Rehoboam appointed Abijah, the son of Maacah, as head and leader among his brothers, for he intended to make him king. And he acted wisely and distributed some of his sons through all the territories of Judah and Benjamin and all the fortified cities. He gave them food in abundance, and he sought men and wives for them. That's Rehoboam. This is the lineage of Judah. This is the lineage of the Messiah. So this is what he is doing. And then you come down to 2 Chronicles 12 and verse 1. You'll see Judah's apostasy. That's noted in the syllabus. It took place when the kingdom of Rehoboam was established and strong, and he and all Israel with him forsook the law of the Lord. Now, it was always the requirement that when one became king, he was given a copy of the law, and then he had to sit down by himself, not use some scribe or a company of scribes, he was supposed to sit down and write out the whole law by hand as his own personal copy. And that would hopefully then guarantee the fact that the king would have a knowledge of the law. He had to abide by the law, he had to uphold the law, and that just wasn't always true. We'll see later on, we have a king who turns out to be absolutely the greatest king, and he obviously has not gone through that process, because when they find the law and bring it to him, he just absolutely goes into a panic and tears his clothes, because they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So somewhere down the line, this sort of thing is lost. And right here in Rehoboam's family, we find that Rehoboam is going to take Judah with him into apostasy. And so that's found in 2 Chronicles 12, verse 1, verse 14. And also in 1 Kings 14, verses 22 through 24. Now, it's at this time that we have this Pharaoh out of Egypt, and he's found in 2 Chronicles 12, verses 2 through 12, and his name is Shishak. He's the one that I noted for you, the stone that had his name upon it. And so in verse 2 it says, it came about in King Rehoboam's 5th year, because they had been unfaithful to the Lord, the Shishak of king of Egypt came up against Jerusalem. What's implied in verse 2? Be a good test question. What's implied in verse 2? I know critical thinking is a lost art in high school, but you got to get back into it.
Destroyed.
What's implied?
They're going to be destroyed.
Well, they're going to be destroyed, but who's bringing about the destruction?
God.
Well, more than the Egyptians.
God.
And why do you come to that conclusion?
Been unfaithful.
Well, no, but why do you come to the conclusion just out of that? Oh, yeah, okay, just out of that verse. Because they've been unfaithful to the Lord. That's right. So unfaithful to the Lord then leads you to the conclusion that when Shishak's coming, God raised him up. And this is very typical of what God will do, that if you're going to be a bad boy, you're going to go out to the woodshed. And the woodshed, in this particular case, has a pharaoh by the name of Shishak with 1,200 chariots and 60,000 horsemen. That's a pretty good whip. And so God does that to get them back in line. Because if they continue to go the direction they're going, and no discipline is ever sent their way, then the whole line of the Messiah is going to get messed up. The line is going to be preserved. God's going to make sure it's going to be preserved. You're not going to be a happy camper when you're not doing what God wants you to do, but it also provides an object lesson all the way through. The safest course of action, the right course of action, is always do what God tells you to do. Don't mess around. Don't try to outthink what God is doing. Don't try to bring something else in. Don't try to take something out. Just do it exactly the way that God wants it done. Because there's all sorts of woodshed moments found in the Old Testament that are brought forth into the New Testament. What happens to Ananias and Sapphira in the book of Acts?
They did.
That's a woodshed moment. That's that the church might fear God. So we understand that, hopefully. And some still do not. But here we have Shishak of Egypt, verse 3, with 1,200 chariots, 60,000 horsemen. The people who came with him from Egypt were without number. The Lubim, the Sukkim, and the Ethiopians. These are all neighboring nations that have provided soldiers for Pharaoh's army. And in return, they would then gain the protection of Pharaoh's army, and they would have contributed to Pharaoh's army. many times foreign armies were made up of other mercenaries. Now, there's a problem that comes along with that in many foreign armies is the fact you all don't speak the same language. So many times there was a bit of confusion in the battlefield because you couldn't communicate in the same language. But it was a very common thing to do, especially if you didn't have a world force size of army and you wanted to increase the size of your army, you just went and brought in mercenaries. You paid them. And they would fight on your side for whatever they would gain out of it, whether they're being paid or, and of course mercenaries continued right down till today. There's still mercenaries around. You'll find many of these African nations that are fighting have mercenaries who are fighting with them, who are actually almost serving as advisors, but many of these mercenaries just, when they got out of the army, wherever they were at, just couldn't stand the thought of going back into civilian life, so they hired themselves out as mercenaries. They may not be government approved by the nation that they left, but they're mercenaries. These are mercenaries that you would find. Verse 4, and he captured the fortified cities of Judah and came as far as Jerusalem. Well, you remember that Rehoboam's been over here in chapter 11, just getting everything built up, strengthening everything. Well, God raises up Shishak, so what's going to happen to the defenses of Judah? They can't withstand Shishak because God's the one who raised him up. Came as far as Jerusalem. Then Shemaiah the prophet. Now here's another prophet. This is Shemaiah the prophet. Came to Rehoboam and the princes of Judah who had gathered at Jerusalem because of Shishak. And he said to them, thus says the Lord, you have forsaken me, so I also have forsaken you to Shishak. So there's a confirmation of what we came up with just a while ago. God raised up Shishak. He is the whip of the moment.
Okay, going back to that archaeological piece of evidence, when did you say that was?
I
thought you said 18 something, I'm not sure.
That's, yeah, it just notes the time in which it was made would be somewhere around 925, 926 BC. And I don't have the information right here as to when it was found. Although, there is another article that I have that you don't have. Why Pharaoh Shishak could not have been Pharaoh Shishak. And they say, yeah, 1828 is the dating for that. So there's Shishak, and God is using him, and God is telling those of Judah that he is using them, and he's telling them through Shemaiah the prophet. So, you have forsaken me, so I also have forsaken you to Shishak. So the princes of Israel and the king humbled themselves and said, the Lord is righteous. There's a penitent heart right there. And when the Lord saw that they humbled themselves, the word of the Lord came to Shemaiah, saying, they have humbled themselves, so I will not destroy them, but I will grant them some measure of deliverance, and my wrath shall not be poured out on Jerusalem by means of Shishak. But they will become his slaves, so that they may learn the difference between my service and the service of the kingdoms of the country. Remember what it says in Matthew 6, verse 24? About two masters?
Serve two.
You can't serve two masters. You either love the one and hate the other. So it's not going to work, so they will, through a continued service, which is a part of the disciplining process, you'll say, boy, I wish I was back with God. Wish this would all be gone. But Jerusalem is not going to be captured by Shishak. So Shishak, king of Egypt, verse 9, came up against Jerusalem, took the treasures of the house of the Lord, the treasures of the king's palace. He took everything. He even took the golden shields which Solomon had made. So those golden shields were there in the temple until this time. And that does not indicate that Shishak got into Jerusalem. That just indicates that they bought Shishak off. Verse 10, then King Rehoboam made shields of bronze in their place and committed them to the care of the commanders of the guard who guarded the door of the king's house. Now these would not be solid gold shields. Gold is an extremely heavy metal. So you're not going to have solid gold shield. But there is a gold leaf. There's a gold covering. There's a pounding of gold. It becomes quite malleable in its purest form once you get all the dross out of it when you purify it. And it can be pounded into a metal that is very, very thin. And that's probably, you're probably looking at a wooden shield that was overlaid with gold. So there were golden shields. And the same way with the bronze. The bronze would have been formed to adhere. They would have fastened the bronze to the wooden shields. But bronze replacing gold, rather sad right there. And then in verse 11, it happened as often as the king entered the house of the Lord, the guards came and carried them and then brought them back into the guard's room. And when he humbled himself, okay, that's Rehoboam. When he humbled himself, the anger of the Lord turned away from him so as not to destroy him completely, and also conditions were good in Judah. So it doesn't say how long the influence of Shishak would be. But you'll note, as you continue down through this section in 2 Chronicles 12, if you're looking at your outline, 2 Chronicles 12, there's a continued warfare between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. So there's actually a civil war that's going on right here. And that's found in the latter part of 2 Chronicles 12 and the middle of verse 15. Also in 1 Kings 14:30 and 1 Kings 15, verse 6. Then Rehoboam's reign and death is noted in 2 Chronicles 12 and verse 13. So King Rehoboam strengthened himself in Jerusalem and reigned. Now Rehoboam was 41 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city which the Lord had chosen from all the tribes of Israel to put his name there. His mother's name was Naamah the Ammonitess. And then it's going to note to the death of Rehoboam. Come down to verse 15a. Now the acts of Rehoboam from the first to the last, are they not written in the records of Shemaiah the prophet and of Iddo the seer? Now there's two different words that are used there in the Hebrew. One is for prophet and the other is for seer. And the word seer is the more ancient term that was used. We'll note the distinction a little bit later on. But maybe we noted it back in the book of Judges. But seer was the term that was used earlier on. It's the older name for the same individual. And then as time went on, it went from seer to prophet. And prophet better describes the individual than seer. Seer is a term that we would think of when we think of prophets in this day and age, that a prophet is one who foretells the future. Not true. The prophet is the one who speaks for God.
When it says that Rehoboam eventually humbled himself and God's wrath subsided, is there any indication that Rehoboam continued in his humility, or did he just go right back to his old ways?
No, when you look at the Acts of Rehoboam, let's see, yeah, verse 14 is the key. So he repents for the moment, but then he goes back to his evil ways, and that's the way we leave him as an evil king. Anyway, continuing on and just noting the death of Rehoboam, and verse 15 says, "Now the acts of Rehoboam from first to last are they not written?" So you've got Shemaiah, he kept a record of the acts of Rehoboam, and a prophet by the name of Edo, who is called a seer right here. According to the genealogical enrollment, and there were wars between Rehoboam and Jeroboam continually. There's your civil war that's going on. And then verse 16, well, go back to verse 14. He did evil because he did not set his heart to seek the Lord. That's the way we leave him, as an evil king. And then verse 16, Rehoboam slept with his fathers, was buried in the city of David, and his son Abijah became king in his place. Now you'll note in the syllabus that I have points to remember in Rehoboam's reign. These are just major points. Number one, he brought about the division of the kingdom. So the division is torn, 2 tribes to the south and 10 tribes to the north. Then also in Rehoboam's reign, you have God's bringing in of Shishak in order to discipline him. It does for the moment bring about repentance. And so God does not destroy the house of Rehoboam. And then a third point is war with Jeroboam. Jeroboam is going to outlive Rehoboam, but there is a constant war that's going on between the house of Jeroboam and the house of Rehoboam. Just a civil war. And it doesn't give you any indication as to great battles or anything like that. So we come down to, still staying under Judah, we come down to Abijah. This is going to be the son of Rehoboam. He's only going to reign for 3 years. And we might go back to 1 Kings 14 for this. In 1 Kings 14, looking at verse 31, Rehoboam slept with his fathers, was buried with his fathers in the city of David. Mother's name was Naamah the Ammonitess, and Abijah his son became king in his place. And you'll also note in chapter 15, verses 1 and 2, it says, "Now in the 18th year of King Jeroboam," see, he's still alive, "the son of Nebat," Jeroboam's son of Nebat, "Abijah became king over Judah. He reigned 3 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom." Now, when we looked at her in 2 Chronicles 11, verse 20, it was Maacah, the wife of Rehoboam. And then we have down here that she is Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom. But then we will find in a different place that it is, this is Maacah, the mother of Abijah. Sometimes we have different fathers' names given for the wife, but that would be just that the father is known by more than one name. But that's not the case here, so this all lines up quite well. You'll note in your outline at the bottom of the syllabus that there's war between Abijah and Jeroboam in 1 Kings 15 and verse 7. It says, "Now the rest of the acts of Abijah and all he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? And there was war between Abijah and Jeroboam." Now when you continue on in the outline, you'll find Abijah's character or at least Abijah's family. That should be 2 Chronicles 13, verse 21. 2 Chronicles 13, verse 21. It's wrong on the outline. And I would have you put down family rather than character, because his character is noted in 1 Kings 15. In his family, he has 14 wives. He's the father of 22 sons and 16 daughters. 14 wives, 22 sons, 16 daughters.
Abijam it is?
Pardon me?
Who are you talking about? Abijam.
Right there in your outline. Right up here.
I couldn't see that if I was in.
Well, I hope it gives you enough of a reference that you're able to follow it in your syllabus. So when you come down to 1 Kings 15, verses 3 through 5, it says that he walked in all the sins of his father, which he had committed before him, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God like the heart of his father David. But for David's sake, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem to raise up his son after him and to establish Jerusalem. Because David did what was right in the sight of the Lord and had not turned aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life, except in the case of Uriah the Hittite. So that particular point concerning David is always noted. Then it's the murder of Uriah the Hittite, the taking of Uriah's wife Bathsheba. And of course there's war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. That just continues on with Abijah, who is sometimes referred to as Abijam. And then you'll note his death in looking at 2 Chronicles 13, verse 22. It says, now the rest of the acts of Abijah and his ways and his words are written in the treatise of the prophet Edom. And then you'll note in chapter 14, so Abijah slept with his fathers, and they buried him in the city of David, and his son Asa became king in his place. So we enter into the time of Asa. Asa is going to reign for 41 years, but the points to remember in Abijah's reign, there's war between Abijah and Jeroboam, primarily because there's been war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. There is noted within the text, and we didn't note it, a temporary victory over Jeroboam. And then number 3, he walked in all the sins of his father, so he is not counted as a good king. But Asa comes along now, and Asa is going to reign for 41 years. He's going to come to the throne in the 20th year of Jeroboam. So it's really close now to Jeroboam's time of departure. And if you look at 1 Kings 15 and look at the latter part of verse 8, it says, Asa began to reign as king of Judah. Looking at, verse 8, Asa, his son, became king in his place. This is 1 Kings 15, verse 8. Verse 9, 20th year of Jeroboam, the king of Israel. Asa began to reign as king of Judah. He reigned 41 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom. That will cause a little bit of difficulty if you have anybody in the Bible class who's really been paying attention to names and is really fixed on genealogical lines. They're going to come up with, wait a minute. Go back to verse 2. His mother's name was Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom. Then his son, no, it's not the mother. Verse 10 is actually his grandmother. That's not unusual in the Hebrew text to find a father referring to a grandfather or a mother referring to a grandmother. So context is going to determine, is it a mother or a grandmother? When we come into the book of Daniel, you're going to find Belshazzar, who is the son of Nabonidus, who sees the handwriting on the wall. It says in the text that his father is Nebuchadnezzar. No, his father's Nabonidus. His grandfather is Nebuchadnezzar. So that's just the way the Hebrew puts it. I wish the English translators had taken a closer look and made it grandmother instead of mother. Technically, it is mother, but she's actually a grandmother.
New King James, though.
What does the King James do with all that?
The New King James uses grandmother.
Ah, good. Yeah, that would be correct. So he reigned 41 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was, or grandmother's name was Maacah, was the daughter of Absalom. And look at verse 11 right here, as we're looking at what he's going to be like. Asa did what was right in the sight of the Lord, like David his father. And we're going to see a little bit more of that as we get on into the text. But this is in the 20th year of Jeroboam. In 2 Chronicles 14, there's going to be 10 years of peace. We'll not go to that, but it's noted right there in the syllabus. That's something that occurs. It's not found in the First Kings section. It is found in 2 Chronicles 14. His character is found here in 1 Kings 15, verse 11. Asa did what was right in the sight of the Lord, like David his father. That's also noted in a little bit more detail in 2 Chronicles 14, verses 2 through 5, which is noted in the syllabus, and that is in reference to his first Reformation. He's had 2 kings before him that have sort of messed the country up, and he's going to bring about a religious reformation in order that people might get back to God. That's what God wants. That may be one reason why he reigned for 41 years. He did what was right in the sight of God. It's during this time that Jeroboam dies. And if you go back to 1 Kings 14, verses 19 and 20, it says, "Now the rest of the acts of Jeroboam, how he made war and how he reigned, behold, they're written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel." Now this is the first time we have seen this phraseology. We're going to see it many times more. When we end up with a king, it's going to say, "The rest of the acts of Jeroboam, how he made war and how he reigned, behold, they are written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel." We don't have that book. That is not referring to 1st and 2nd Chronicles. That's referring to a separate writing that was done by a scribe who was probably hired by the court to record everything the king did. Now, interestingly, these scribes, as they would write everything the king did, were sometimes working on a bias because the king was paying them the money to write, so many times they just write everything was good, not anything was bad. So it's not a part of inspired scripture. This is just a notation. I don't know of anybody who has ever noted in any archaeological dig, "Oh, we found the chronicles of the king of Israel." But they seem to have been passed down from generation to generation within the kings of Israel, and then a new scribe would be hired. He'd write in everything, this is what this king did, and then so on and so forth. It would make probably for interesting reading, but I suspect it would be very biased. And it's not a part of the inspired text. It's just noted in the inspired text that there is that. And maybe it was available to some at one time, but we don't have anything today that would note that. So this is Jeroboam, and it says in verse 20, "In the time that Jeroboam reigned was 22 years, and he slept with his fathers, and Nadab his son reigned in his place. So Nadab becomes king. He will be king number 2 in the northern kingdom of Israel. He'll only reign for 2 years. Come down here to verse 25 of 1 Kings 15 rather. 1 Kings 15 verse 25. Now Nadab the son of Jeroboam became king over Israel in the 2nd year of Asa, king of Judah, and he reigned over Israel 2 years. And then with his death, that'll be the end of that particular house. Points to remember in Jeroboam's reign, he fulfilled the prophecy concerning the 10 tribes. Remember Ahijah carrying his cloak? Set up 2 golden calves. One was set up at Bethel, the other was set up at Dan. Convenient religion was the order of the day. He's the one who drove out the Levites. Actually, the Levites were really glad to get out of there because that would get them back to Jerusalem, which is the center of worship, but it would also get them away from a nasty king of Israel. And then number 4, he made his own priests. So he didn't have a Levitical priesthood, he just had his own priests. And so Jeroboam goes down in history as an evil king. So we come to Nadab under Israel. Nadab comes to the throne as number 2 king. We find him in 1 Kings 14, verse 20. We've already seen him in 1 Kings 15 and verse 25. Where it says, Nadab the son of Jeroboam became king over Israel in the 2nd year of Asa, king of Judah, and reigned over Israel 2 years. So when Asa becomes king, Jeroboam's only got 2 years left. Nadab's character is seen in 1 Kings 15 and verse 26. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, walked in the way of his father, and in the sin which he made Israel sin. So when the house of Jeroboam is going to be completely destroyed, Nadab just helps that along by being as evil as his father. Then Nadab's death is noted very quickly, 1 Kings 15. Verse 31, rest of the acts of Nadab, all he did, were they not read the book of Chronicles of the kings of Israel? Yeah, but we don't have it. And verse 27, then Baasha the son of Ahijah, this is the Baasha who is the assassin. Baasha the son of Ahijah of the house of Issachar. So here we are with the house of Issachar, conspired against him, and Baasha struck him down at Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines, while Nadab and all Israel were laying siege to Gibbethon. So here's Nadab. He's the king of the northern kingdom of Israel. The army of the northern kingdom of Israel has gone out to fight against Gibbethon. He's right there. And Baasha, who is of the house of Issachar, conspired against him, probably right there on the battlefield, and it may be while Nadab had his back turned to his own men, he got it. So he's assassinated. As it says, he struck him down at Gibbethon, which belongs to the Philistines. So here's the Philistines already. Northern kingdom of Israel is having to fight against the Philistines. Philistines have been left in the land. Should have gotten rid of them a long time ago, but you didn't. So the points to remember in Nadab's reign is he's evil like his father, and he dies a violent death at the hand of Baasha. Well, there's no messianic line with this northern kingdom, so you get a guy coming in from this tribe, then he bumps off this guy from this tribe, and then another guy comes in from this tribe. The tragedy of all of this is that they're all Jews, so they're just bumping each other off for a chance at the throne. So the number 3 king of the northern kingdom of Israel is going to be Baasha. He's going to reign for 24 years. We find him here in 1 Kings 15, looking at verses 28-30. Baasha killed him in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, reigned in his place. And because of the sins of Jeroboam, which he sinned, and which he made Israel sin, because of his provocation with which he provoked the Lord God of Israel to anger. So this is of course the removal of the house of Jeroboam right here. And that's what we note back here in verse 29. And it notes in verse 29, remember Ahijah the Shilonite, the prophet of chapter 14, 1 through 18? He's the one who said, no, house of Jeroboam's going to end. He told that to Jeroboam's wife. As soon as she stepped over the threshold, the child died. 1 Kings 33 and 34 still talking about Baasha. 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, Baasha the son of Ahijah became king over all Israel. That's a different Ahijah. And reigned 24 years. He did even the side of the Lord, walked in the way of Jeroboam in the sin which he made Israel sin. Now every one of the kings of Israel, you're going to find this with it. Every one of the kings of Israel, they're all evil. There's not a good one in the bunch. Which has to be a terrible disappointment to God, but there you are. How does God handle that? God already knows, even before the foundation of the earth, that all the kings of Israel are going to be evil. When exactly is he disappointed with that? Does he already know? Good question. You can say that when you talk to him face to face. I have a sermon that's entitled, Who Comforts God? You know, and all of the difficulties that go on, and all the difficulties that go on with his children, and with divorce and remarriage, and all of that for certain children. Who comforts God? God comforts us. God's children comfort us. It's very important, right? But who comforts God? And you could say, well, the Son comforts the Father, and the Father comforts the Son, and the Holy Spirit comforts both of them. The answer is, we comfort God. That's the answer. We comfort God. By our being good children. By being children who He loves and draws near to. He draws near to those who are humble and contrite of heart. Those would be His children. That's who He's most comfortable with, would be the humble and contrite. So if you have a problem, or if I have a problem with pride, we're actually getting away from God, because He's not comfortable with the prideful. He's comfortable with the humble and contrite. So I would say that behooves us to really work on our humble, contrite side rather than our prideful side. But it's so easy to be prideful. I mean, the brethren will tell you all the time, oh, I've never heard such great lessons. Oh, I've never, you must be a walking Bible. And after a while, you start believing it. Don't do that, because that gets the pride. Then your hat won't fit anymore. You have to buy a whole new wardrobe because your head's too big.
Remy hears that all the time, sir, but I've never heard it.
Okay, that's where we'll stop. Pick it up next time.